So now, usually we kind of start just by kind of introducing what the class is, and then we can go kind of start getting into the material. But first, we'll kind of lay out just what the semester is going to look like. So probably makes sense to just share. Let me just share my screen here then. All right, so this is kind of the home page on Canvas. We're still primarily in Canvas for kind of structuring the class because we're still got lots of online content of the class. Syllabus, kind of where is the easy place to find the link to get into the lecture or to office hours. It's the same link whether or not it's for everything in this class. You just click on that and it'll either be lecture or be office hours or whatever. We can start with me, Dr. David Eggert. My background is official. In fact, I should probably, if I'm talking, I can wait, where's my little control thing? So my background is in neuroscience. My original research that I did in grad school was looking at the ear, looking at how, we process sounds, how we can extract information from all the auditory, vibrations that are coming in. How can you tell if there's a tiger snapping on a branch amongst all the wind and the birds tweeting and things like that? But more recently, I've gotten into, so hold on, Amanda. We should not, I'm gonna stop you from sharing here. Or can you, Amanda, can you stop your sharing, please? Thank you. So yeah, more recently, I've been collaborating with a friend at Berkeley looking at MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So I've been part of one of the clinical trials looking at using MDMA ecstasy in conjunction with talk therapy to deal with trauma, anxiety. And I've been actually doing brain imaging, taking the subjects before they go through the treatment, after they go through the treatment, and looking at what kind of activity we see in their brain as they're responding to anxious stimuli. And it's actually very encouraging results. It really seems like this kind of therapy really does help people look at the same images or same situations that would have caused more anxiety that they could not modulate on their own, and they have much more of an ability to kind of stabilize themselves. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool results. So I do that, but all of physiology is really cool. As we get into the semester, you're going to find everything is completely entangled. Like trying to understand the brain is then getting into all the hormones, and then the hormones get into your immune system, and your immune system is intercalated into every little bit and piece of you, and trying to figure out control of the cardiovascular system. Some of it is hormonal, some of it is neuronal. It's everything gets all entangled. This idea of body systems is very artificial. It makes it easy to kind of segment it in the beginning so you can kind of look at one piece or another piece without getting overwhelmed by everything. But the reality is, as we get deeper and deeper into the semester, you're going to see all these interconnections between everything. So it's pretty cool. So let me get back to our little review thing here. So that's me. My email is deggert@marin.edu. That is the best way to get a hold of me. I officially have a phone, but especially now, I don't check the messages. I don't even know if I have messages on that thing. So please contact me via email. That's how I will actually hear from you. Office hours are on Zoom after our lab. So Tuesdays and Thursdays after class from 12:30 to 1:30, or by appointment. We can also come up with other times if that doesn't work for you, if there's something up for you there. We can talk about, either how you're doing in the class, talk about clarification on any of the material, whatever. It is, I try to be accessible and not intimidating as much as possible. Like if you are having issues or problems, it's good to like reach out. And this is the kind of class where if you start getting buried and start drowning, it's really hard to dig yourself out if goes too long. So you really want to be a little more proactive rather than thinking like, oh, after, I'll catch up at some point. It's like you really do need to be kind of proactive around trying to make sure you don't kind of slip under the waves. All right, what else here? Biology, 1 semester course, exploring function of the body. That's kind of what I was talking about. Lecture notes and handouts are the best indication of what you'll be responsible for in exams. Everybody is like, is that gonna be on the test? Obviously I'm trying to like minimize your stress so you have some idea of what you're actually responsible for. There is in the lab manual that you all hopefully now possess. In the back, there's an Appendix A. There's also a link to it right here. And it's basically just a little review of, it's kind of a study guide. Here are kind of all some of the main points that for sure we're going to cover. Often, there's some kind of improvisational nature to the class as well. We'll cover things that might not be on here. But as a starting point for what do you need to know, this is the kind of stuff we're going to be covering in lecture. This is a good place to use as a study guide when you're studying for exams. What? So again, it's linkable here as well as being in print in the back of your lab manual. Your notes as well are a good indication of things you're responsible for. In general, I'm not going to test you on something that we never ever talked about. That'd be silly. And for that matter, I should mention, the book. We'll talk more about the process of getting your free book if you haven't got it yet. But the book has more information in it than we are going to cover or that you are responsible for.
Professor,
the book, say it again.
Professor, I was wondering, the book that you put online looks way different than the book that you just showed.
The book that I put online. This is the book that they're giving you for free.
Right, but you also had one on the bookstore, and I bought that one.
Oh, interesting. That might be, okay, so.
I have the same book.
I have a copy. It's this one. This is the one that I.
Oh man, okay, so this is because I think the bookstore rolled over like an old, that book is fine too, but the other book is fine and is free for you. So that sure, the basic idea for this class is any college level physiology textbook is fine. We're not going to be doing any specific assignments out of any specific textbook. That being said, it's important to have a textbook because when you're trying to like review things or trying to understand things, or you want to have a good resource, whether or not it's the Sherwood book or the Silverthorne book. They're slightly different in their approaches, but it's the same basic material. Yes, if you bought the Sherwood and you like owning a copy of a textbook that you're going to hold on to, I'd say that's great. If you were thinking that that's more money than you want to spend right now and you want to have a free book, we arranged through the bookstore to have these books loaned out just for the, the next 4 months as a way to kind of reduce costs of the class. So yeah, I apologize. That was not supposed to still be on the bookstore. Should have just been, there's 2 things you do need to buy. You need to buy a lab notebook because you are going to be writing up labs. You do need to buy the lab manual from Reprographics, which should only be like $15 or something. But the textbook, and again, I don't know if you need, I can talk to the bookstore and, they should, hopefully they take it back if you don't want it. Or I guess you can hold on to it because it will work just fine. In some ways, not in some ways, I actually do think the Sherwood text is a little more straightforward. Silverthorne tries to, I think, kind of get more into that integrative aspect of things, but in doing so, I think it gets more confusing because you get to see kind of the end at the beginning to some degree. So even though the Sherwood is a much more kind of old school, kind of conservative approach, I think it's actually a little easier to understand. But that being said, either book is fine. How many people actually bought the Sherwood book? So a few of you. Again, it's a good one. So you won't regret having it, but again, if you want, you can return it and you will get a free book, The Silverthorne, for the semester. Let's see. All right, we're still here. Laboratory. I'll talk more about laboratory when we have the lab section later on this morning. Officially lab starts around 9:40, but somewhere around 10 o'clock this morning, we're gonna continue in Zoom. We'll take a break, right? I'm not gonna keep you in Zoom for 4.5 hours straight, but we will be in general meeting from 8 in the morning till 12:30. And again, I am so stoked to actually have at least a few days where we'll be actually in person. The first one will be later this month, where we do the chemistry lab, and we'll talk more about that. So lab, though, I'll talk more about when we have kind of the lab part of our class today. Asking questions, like I mentioned earlier, it's not, you don't want to fall behind. So if I'm saying something and it doesn't really make sense, it's good to stop me, because that way you get clarification, and then I don't just start building on a base of sand where nothing is making sense to you. So, and usually if you have a question, you're not the only one, and other people are just a little more shy, and then everybody's stoked that you were bold and asked the question. So I would say that prereqs, I do assume that you have basic understanding of chemistry and biology. We'll be starting, I'll do a quick review this week, and a little bit beginning of next week is going to be kind of just whirlwind review of most important chemistry concepts that the rest of the class is being built on. But it is really important to know covalent versus ionic bonds, or polar versus nonpolar, or what an ion is, what does it mean to gain or lose an electron, and how does that affect the properties of the atom and things like that. So again, I will be quickly reviewing the main concepts you need to know, but it's not like we're going to be.
This one, they don't have a jack for the phones anymore.
Right.
And then I was like,
it's not like we're going to be spending enough time to, if you knew it and you kind of forgot it, this will be enough to kind of fluff up your memories. But if we're getting into this and you're realizing, I have no idea what's going on, you really do need to take the initiative to go and review these concepts. I have included links to different Khan Academy stuff, but pH, basic bonds, what it means to, again, ionic versus covalent, things like that. It is going to be critical to understand because, at the core level, you are a bunch of metabolic pathways running all these chemical reactions going on, and you can't understand physiology. In fact, a lot of this class is going to be either chemistry or physics, flows versus, driven by pressure gradients and resistances, like pushing back. We're going to be looking at the body, from these different lenses of physics, of chemistry, and seeing how those all work together to understand what's going on in the body. This is very different from anatomy, where you just kind of put labels on everything. Right, what else? You are required to arrive on time. So we're going to have most of our lectures in Zoom, assuming I can figure out how to do it. I'm also going to record. We'll have a few lectures in class. I'll make sure I record those as well. And I still am cleaning up the modules and stuff for the new semester, but basically what I do, this is like stuff from last semester. Usually after the class is done, I'll pull it into Premiere and I'll edit the lectures and upload them, and they'll be linked on Canvas. So you'll be able to access anything we do in class on through Canvas later on if you want to review things. So there is going to be that. Back to yeah, biology. You should know what a cell is. You should know what meiosis versus mitosis is. Things like that. I will. We're going to go deeper into all this stuff, but the very basics. The mitochondria making ATP should not be a surprise to you, but in this class, we're going to spend like probably an entire day going more into detail, like what exactly is going on in the mitochondria and what are the different metabolic pathways and where is the energy being transferred, in this process to actually start with a, sugar molecule and somehow end up with a whole bunch of these ATP molecules. So we'll kind of look under the hood a little more. It's not just the powerhouse of the cell. It's like what exactly is going on in there. Again, if you've done more majors biology, that's stuff you've already known, but a lot of people haven't seen that yet. Blah, 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 blah. This, there are a bewildering number of new and strange terms. Learning things takes practice, repetition, and time. I know people get discouraged in the beginning because it seems overwhelming. And that is really typical, especially if you're learning something that's new. There's all sorts of studies on memory. Like if you're adding memories to something where you already have some basic foundation of knowledge, then you have kind of like this matrix that you can take this new thing and kind of attach it into and situate it. Like when you have really new concepts that you haven't really spent time with and you're trying to remember them, it's like kind of, I don't know, it's like throwing like something up against a really slippery wall and it kind of just slides off. And you have to kind of keep throwing stuff at the wall and slowly pieces start sticking. And then the more that stuff starts sticking, then it makes it easier for other stuff to stick. So, but in the beginning in particular, I find people often get kind of overwhelmed and a little terrified. Is this going to be too much? But typically it gets way easier as things start rolling. Repetition, I mean, that's just part of memory too. It's like I find I can read something or hear something and it makes sense. And then I go back and like, wait, what was that? And it's like, oh, I lost it. So that's another thing that you need to spend time. This is not a class where you can just kind of see it, review it once before the exam and go in and just nail it. Typically that's a recipe to to kind of not do well. So just advising that this class does take a lot of time to study and kind of go back and review things and then start interconnecting things. I just put a little thing, reading ahead, the textbook, whether or not you've got the Silverthorne or the Sherwood, it is useful to skim ahead of time. I would not read in depth before lectures because you don't know what we're focusing on unless you just are that kind of person who just wants to learn everything as deep as you can and you've got the time to do it. But if you're trying to be a little more kind of focused with how much time do you have to actually dedicate to the class, you probably want to skim first. And then after we've gone through lectures and you have a better sense of what are you really responsible for, you can go back and look at those sections in more depth. This book is a good resource, but like I said, it goes deeper into certain things than we will necessarily go into, which I like. It means that if you want, you can go look a little deeper. The schedule. So the schedule I have color coded. The days that are in yellow are actually in person, which again, I felt really kind of bad over the last 3 semesters that, we were online for something let's learn how to take blood pressures by clicking a mouse on a button on the screen. It's kind of messed up. So we're gonna, I tried to minimize how much, so we're doing a couple of chemistry ones. This rods and cones one it's just fun. We're going to do the EKG. We're going to do blood pressure, blood work, a little spirometry. We'll still be doing some online labs as well. Over the last year, Tina and actually a couple of the other physiology professors figured out some online versions of the labs. So we'll do some of the labs online in Zoom, but we'll have a few core ones in person. So this is on campus. So Kentfield campus. I guess everybody has to be, you have to wear a mask to be in which I think is just a great idea. And starting September 1st, everybody's got to be vaccinated to be on campus as well. So I'll be updating my Canvas thing and sending out an email to everybody with any details. I just got back into town late last night, so I don't have everything exactly as updated as it should be. The green things are the exams. Those are happening when we're actually on campus. They are, combination of short answer and Scantron. So you will need Scantron forms. And for the class, you'll need 4 Scantron forms because there's 4 exams through the semester. Each of these exams covers fundamentally the material right before it. They're kind of like unit exams. Like this first exam will cover everything from today until exam 1. Exam 2, though, is going to focus on the central nervous system and muscle physiology. However, the concepts that we're going to talk about, this week are going to still be important till the end of the semester. So things do build, so don't get into the trap of thinking like I got lost in the chemistry and this signal transduction, but we're past that, we're moving on. It's like we're going to be talking about chemistry and signal transduction in the last day of class. It's going to be essential parts of understanding the reproductive system and the endocrine system. So even though the exams are kind of unit exams, everything does build on itself. So, you want to keep up. You don't want to think like that. I was lost there, but maybe I'll catch up on the next part. You'll just get more lost. For the labs, some of the labs are this fuchsia magenta that require pre-labs. I'll talk about that later in lab. But the purple is something to pay attention to as well. These mid-unit quizzes in aqua, these are just like little 10-point multiple choice things. Those will be through Zoom. Those won't be in person. So we'll talk about those as they come up. There's a couple of holidays. Exam 4, this is actually during the finals week. Even though it's during finals week, it's basically another unit exam. It is going to be, on the reproductive, endocrine, digestive, body defenses, actually, and urinary system. So it'll cover a lot, but it is not like a comprehensive exam. That being said, let me go back here. So information regarding grading. Where did I? All right. So here is kind of the grading criteria. And again, it's always one of those things of like, ultimately, this is a journey understanding our bodies. It's just kind of a really cool thing, but people also are trying to get into nursing school and stuff and care about their grades, which I understand. So you want to kind of keep track. The lecture exams are like half the grade. These are those ones, again, we're going to be in person. They're going to be mix of short answer and Scantron. It says you may replace your lowest score on any of the first 3 by taking an optional comprehensive exam at the end of the semester. The point of this is knowing that sometimes people have a slow start, like they don't quite understand what it takes to succeed, and they kind of eat it on the first exam, and then they actually manage to get on track and do great for the rest of the semester. But then they've got like this, D or F exam sitting there, kind of pulling down the averages of everything. So what this, or sometimes maybe just some life threw you some crazy curveball and you just were not in the right headspace. Your dog was, you died in your arms that morning and now you're taking a physiology exam or something. So you have the ability to replace your lowest of these first 3 exams with this exam that is a comprehensive final exam. We'll figure out a time to take it during finals week. It will cover everything from the very beginning of the chemistry to the end of reproductive system. But again, my thought is, if you can show me at the end of the semester that you really know, what we're hoping that you learn through this semester, that's what's important, rather than the fact that for whatever reason you ate it on an exam once during the semester. So I'll talk more about the optional thing at the end of the semester, but you can just kind of know that if one exam pulls you down, you have a way to actually, you can get an F on the first exam and get an A in the class. But it would mean really doing some, honest looking about what happened there and making sure you made some very concrete changes to re-engage the class and make sure your next exam is better. Quizzes, the quizzes are only 4% because they're more to kind of just keep you awake and help me see that people are keeping up. Lab exam and sundry, there's going to be a couple of lab exams. These I decided to just do online as well, just to kind of make life easier. But they're going to cover material from our labs, and they'll be more specific about things we actually do either in lab or in the Zoom labs. And we'll talk more about these lab exams in the lab part. Research project and presentation. This is something we started when we went into Zoom. We used to do more in-person kind of designing research projects and carrying out the experiments and writing them up, which I still think is a really good experience. But in order not to be on campus and in person and getting, usually for doing experiments, you end up getting subjects who are strangers, and it just it's a mess right now. So instead, we're going to have a research project, which is on any topic related to physiology, although it does have to be approved, and hopefully something you're interested in. I wonder if I could even find, yeah, I'll show you, and we're talking about this later. People have done things looking at diet, looking at all sorts of things that they're actually genuinely interested in, like how does breastfeeding affect the immune system development, or how does this supplement affect this or that. So typically it should be on something you actually are interested in and you think other people might be interested in as well, because then it's actually fun to do. Like, I know for me personally, it's kind of cool when there's actually something I kind of wish I was doing anyway, but life is just so freaking busy. But now I have an excuse because I need to do it for my assignment. So I'm going to spend more time looking into exactly how does, I don't know, creatine phosphate affect, my performance in my workout or whatever. People have all these things that they're reading about, but they're wondering, is it really true or not? Let's go into the scientific literature and see what experimental evidence is there for such and such. And again, we'll talk about this in way more detail. We'll have a few, we call scaffolding assignments, just to kind of get you used to getting into the scientific literature and trying to see how do you actually find out what has been done, what do we know about certain things. Homework assignments, there'll be a couple. Note, you must pass both lecture and lab sections. The lab notebook, there's quite a bit of work in the lab notebook where you have to kind of write up both kind of the objectives, like what is the point of what we're doing in the lab, as well as the data of what we gather in the lab, as well as the kind of discussion about how does it all come together and is our hypothesis supported or not, and all that kind of stuff. So you do need to pay attention both to the lecture part of the class, which will be more of, the book stuff, as well as the lab part of the class, which is going to be more of a practical thing of either demonstrating concepts or also a lot of work on just how do we go about trying to learn stuff, right? We got a book claiming to tell us all this cool stuff about how the body works. And it's how do they know? How come we should listen to them? What process did they go through to actually come up with this stuff that they're telling you? So that's part of what we're going to be doing in lab, is looking more closely at that process of kind of scientific discovery and kind of giving you more of a sense of when you're reading some report of some scientific finding, giving you more of a critical eye on do I believe that or not, or how much, so blah, blah, blah. Grading scale. Oh, please, no cheating or plagiarism. especially with the online stuff, there have been a couple of people who failed in the last year just because there's just like egregious, like, so please, I know it's like the world is different on Zoom and everything, but ultimately this material is really kind of critical for kind of the next stages. If you actually are going into kind of allied health fields, understanding the core concepts of physiology are going to be the basis for the deeper understanding of how to take care of somebody who's sick, or, so, for many reasons, both, just for senses of personal integrity, as well as just, this is good stuff to know if you want to actually go out there and help people in a competent way. I'd say, if you're getting lost, or I think sometimes people start panicking because they feel really lost. And that's where I was talking about having office hours. We're also going to have probably Chris. I'll have to reach out to him, but we usually have tutors who are available as well. It'll be through Zoom, where you can get help with someone who's not me. Often having a different person can help with understanding things. There's all sorts of cool things on Zoom, not on Zoom, on like Khan Academy and other internet resources. So there are lots of places out there to find information. But I would say, if you are feeling really lost, it is important to try to reach out in whatever ways you can, because hoping it's going to get better without taking proactive steps usually doesn't work.
9 a.m.
9 a.m. All right. Grading scale. This is the basic grading scale. I kind of did it like this because when I first started teaching at the College of Marin, there were no pluses and minuses. So, 80 to 89 was a B. So it seemed like, it seemed 80 still had to be a B right now, 90 still. So I made sure that it's consistent with the old grades before we went to plus and minuses, but it gets a little more wiggle room. You do have to get at least 70% to pass the class. So there is no such thing as a C minus or something, because that's not passing it. It makes it sound kind of like, oh, but that's not real. So 70% and above to pass. This late work is accepted. I'll take like maybe 10% off for each class period that it's missing. But if there's like, you're going to have a 15-point homework assignment coming up, that's going to just review basic chemistry concepts. And if you don't turn it in at all, you get a 0 on it. So that would be like getting a C on a major exam instead of an A. Whereas other people turn it in late and get like 14 points instead of 15 points, and it doesn't affect their grade at all, right? So highly, highly recommend, if for whatever reason you miss turning something in on time, just turn it in late. It's not gonna take that many points off, and it's way better than getting a 0 on something. Blah, blah, blah. So that's that. I left, again, I've got to clean up. I thought I unpublished all this stuff thinking that it would just disappear, but it looks like in like your grade section, there's all sorts of stuff that looks like it's real, that's not real. So I'm going to clean all that up in the next day or two. So your Canvas portal, or the Canvas shell will look much cleaner in the next couple of days. So these are the official in-person classes I put here. The room might change. I've been in discussion with the lab tech, because there's no Bio 110 labs being offered this semester, we might be able to just go in their room and make life easier for the lab tech who's also setting up microbiology. I will tell you the room, it might be 112 instead of 114. But it's gonna be in this, so there'll be like, this Tuesday we'll do a lecture, but in person. I'll be like on a whiteboard, which I miss. Plus, yeah, then you get to move. I guess you guys will still be sitting, but at least I won't be sitting. I'm not used to sitting this much. We'll do this chemistry review lab. We're gonna actually introduce this in Zoom on Thursday and talk about it, but then we'll be doing a lot of kind of more practical things, like actually mixing things and stirring them around and writing our observations in lab. The next one won't be until the middle end of September. Again, there'll be an exam, and then there'll be a break, and then we'll have a lab. Then again in October, we've got more exams and we're in lectures versus labs. So this just kind of gives you a sense of the in-person stuff. So are there any questions? I think I've kind of covered most of the nuts and bolts stuff now. Are there any questions about any of this?
I do. For lab, do we need to bring any lab coats or anything, or do we just come in ourselves?
You need to have your lab notebook, which again is this thing, and a copy of the lab manual, which is, those little loose leaf things from the bookstore. But other than that, and the other thing I'll talk about when we actually do our lab in a little bit, using scissors and tape and glue stick. It sounds kind of like elementary school, but it's actually really useful as well for taking the procedures and cutting them out and taping them into your lab notebook. So having scissors and glue stick, scissors and paste can, but since this is college, you can use like sharp scissors instead of like the round nose scissors.
Is that something you bring with us on lab days, the scissors and glue?
Say it again.
I said, is that something we should bring with us on lab days, the scissors and the glue and all those?
Yeah, it actually is useful. Typically, you can borrow some scissors from a lab mate if there's a critical mass of them. But some kind of a glue stick or tape is useful to kind of assemble. Like, I'm trying to see if I've got, for when we get to our lab a little later, I'll show you some examples of what they look like. But basically, typically there's kind of printouts from the lab manual with the methods just pasted in, so you don't have to longhand just write out everything that's already printed out there for you.
I have a quick question.
Uh-huh.
For the lab notebook, we can just use any notebook, or do we need that one that was on the bookstore?
So it needs to be, there are different brands of similar ones, but it has to have a few different qualities. One is it has to have like this, what do you call it? This graph paper in it. I'm going to do this well. Dagnabbit. There we go.
Okay, because I was like, I'm not spending $16 if it's just a regular notebook. I wasn't sure.
No, so it's got, and it's bound like this. The pages don't come out. Also, the pages are numbered, so you can know which pages are on which page is what. It goes from like 1 to 152. So there's National, there are other brands, but it should be one of these lab notebooks with the graph paper bound with numbered pages. I see like Holly's holding one right there. Yeah, and her camera is not blinking out. So can everybody see her there? I don't know. Yeah, so you will need something that looks like that. And again, we'll talk more about it in a little bit. Other questions?
Yeah. Will the lab exams be on Proctorio?
So say it again, Sienna.
Will the lab exams be on Proctorio?
Yeah, the lab exams will be on Proctorio.
Okay.
So we'll talk more about that. So I've tried to minimize that by having the main exams just regular, but since those are big labs or big exams, I have those. All right, other questions?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I noticed that Chris is not tutoring for our physiology class for 224. He's doing 240. Is there any way you could request that he does do tutoring for our class?
Yeah, I'm surprised that normally he does his class as well. It might be, and typically the tutoring department will give us more hours depending on the requests. So I'll reach out to Chris right after our class today and find out what's going on, as well as Oksana, who is the head of the tutoring stuff.
Yeah, because I personally requested him, and I noticed on the schedule that he's not doing it. It's just Anders and Alyssa.
Well, Anders is great though. Yeah, so it could be they just decided for whatever reason. So that I'm not sure there. So I don't know Melissa. I know Anders and Chris, and they're both great. They also do anatomy.
Yeah, Chris is great. I had him for anatomy as my tutor.
So, and we'll have either Chris or Anders or one of these people come and kind of introduce the tutoring to you guys in the next day or two. So, all right. Other questions? Okay, let me write. Okay. All right. So then we have 20 minutes. We can actually just kind of get into the class. And again, as the semester goes on, if stuff comes up, please ask, or you're confused about something, or if something looks weird in Canvas. The Canvas is really not the most intuitive thing. I've been working on it for like a year and a half now, more in depth since this pandemic started. And it still is so frustrating and has different, I think because it's, it's not designed for like corporate world. It's just like good enough to like run a class. It's really a pretty stinky program to try to like structure things in. And it's easy to like assume that something is happening a certain way and realize like it's not, that it wasn't done that way. So if you like are looking at something in there and you're like, this seems weird, just send me an email. And often it is weird and I have to like click on some little flag and change some setting or something. So, all right, let's do this then. So,
You really don't know where the sauce is at?
say it again. Had I heard somebody? Okay. All right, so here we are. Human physiology. And so this, given that this is what we're going to be looking at for the next 4 months, it's worth putting a little bit of time just into laying out exactly what are we looking at, and kind of, by definition, what is human physiology? What do we mean? I didn't hear. Study of?
Function of the body.
Yeah, study of the function. So we're focusing on the function. That being said, they talk about complementarity of structure and function. you can't really talk about the function without talking about the structure. You can't talk about how a car engine works if you don't talk about cylinders and pistons and valves and gas lines and stuff, right? You can't talk about the cardiovascular system without talking about ventricles and valves, and you can't talk about, the brain without talking about neurons and axons and dendrites. So we are going to bring in a little bit of the anatomy, right? The structure is anatomy. The big difference in this class is we're going to really focus on the function and bring in enough anatomy to actually, be able to explain things. Whereas in anatomy, you brought in the structure, so it seemed interesting. You didn't just describe a ventricle and atria. At least you talked about, oh yeah, and the heart pumps the blood. Anatomy would be pretty dry if you didn't bring in the functional parts. But, in anatomy, you spend a lot of detailed work on different little parts and pieces and different terminology. That's not going to be this class. This class, we'll talk about the anatomy up to the level where it's necessary, but not beyond. We'll focus more on this. When we're talking about function, there's both what we call kind of a mechanistic approach. Spell that right. Versus a teleological approach. Mechanistic meaning just kind of describing how it works. This is more kind of like the how. Whereas teleological is more about the why. Right? Like, for sweating, like a classic example of sweating. Mechanistic would be more talking about the details of the sweat glands and how they create sweat, and maybe a bit of the feedback loop. You've got, sensors in your hypothalamus that are monitoring your temperature and sending messages to deal with your temperature control. But teleological, why do we sweat? To cool down. It's a pretty obvious thing. We have evaporative cooling. When we get really hot, we start sweating. The evaporation of the sweat helps cool us down. So that's kind of an easy one. Like, why do we sweat? To help cool us down. How does it happen? We can also describe the nuts and bolts of what's going on to actually trigger the excretion of sweat on the surface of your skin. Sometimes the why is not so clear. There's a lot of, again, an example I like to bring up is fever. We can talk about it from a mechanistic point. We do know that there are signaling molecules released by white blood cells when you're responding to an infection that talk to your hypothalamus and reset your base temperature a little higher. Now, why is it good to have a fever when you're fighting an infection? That's not so obvious. There's different, depending what book you read, there's different thoughts on why that's useful or why that might make it harder for these bacteria to get certain things they need or whatever. But there's nothing as obvious as like sweat cools you down. Fever does something, obviously, because your body's doing it on purpose, but the why is harder to know. There's other things we'll talk about where, why is it like that? It's like, who knows? It's what it is. So it's much more satisfying if you have a nice why when we're describing things, but you also have to make peace with sometimes we're going to hit things where it's like, who knows why? It's just, this is the way it is. And it's actually still important to understand that this is the way it is. So mechanistic versus teleological. As much as possible, try to have both. But again, sometimes we don't know why, and we can make it up. But this kind of reminds me of those you go to the museum and there's like some little artifact from 3,000 years ago, and they have no idea what it was for, but they're like, must have been probably some kind of ritual, something object. It's like, who knows? It could have, might have been a toy that kids played with, but people, they just kind of make it up because people like to have a nice and they feel more comfortable if they understand it deeper. All right, let's see. That is that. Let's do levels of organization. Let's see if this thing works. Yes. So levels of organization, the classic thing at the beginning of any kind of biology class. And again, let me get back to this now. You know, levels of organization, usually it starts on that kind of chemical level. You know, atoms and molecules. You know, which we are going to spend a lot of time on in this class. We're going to be spending the first couple of weeks just looking at what are the properties of water molecules that make it so important in all of the physiology. What are the relationships of water molecules with covalently bonded molecules, you know, and polar covalent versus non-polar covalent, versus what happens with ionically bonded things when you put them in water. And what are the non-polar interactions that hold together the phospholipids of a cell membrane, and how does that affect the permeability of the membrane? You know, when we try to figure out what can go inside and outside of a cell, it actually is really important to think about just the chemical properties of the molecules that make up the cell membrane. So we are going to be spending a lot of time kind of looking at this level. You know, as we put these together into the fundamental units of life, you get down to the cells. You know, we'll be spending the first month of this class looking more at generic cells rather than any specific system, right? Because your body is made out of tens of trillions of cells that somehow all coordinate to be this one organism, you. You know, you don't feel like some consensus among 10 trillion separate little things. They're all obviously all locked into each other and coordinating with each other and communicating with each other and all creating this kind of unified experience of being the human organism. So we really need to spend time looking at how cells do their basic metabolic functions, how they do their basic communication and sensing of what's going on around and coordinating things, how they move things in and out of themselves. So we'll be spending a lot of energy in the first part of this class, really focusing in on the, it's supposed to be an eyeball. Let me try this. Let me do this. We'll put a lot of time into focusing on the chemical part, the cell part, which you don't do. If you've been in anatomy, you basically start at the tissues, the histology, right? You talk about certain cells, but you don't spend a whole lot of time looking at the details of the cells. This class, we're going to really build a strong foundation on kind of the real basic processes that are at the core of everything. It doesn't matter what system you're looking at. You know, your organs, your tissues are all made out of cells, and the cells all have some basic ways of dealing with being cells and coordinating with each other. Next, you know, you get to the tissues. This is kind of more where you started if you were in anatomy. getting more into the basic tissue types. In this class, we'll spend some time on them, but not tons of time. Or I should say on all. We'll spend a lot of time on epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues, which kind of line and cover things. These are what are defining the boundary of the inside versus the outside. What's you and what's not you. So the epithelial tissues will be particularly interesting for us because they are kind of creating that, that boundary of what's inside and what's outside. What is part of your body, what's not part of your body. So we will be looking at epithelial tissues in quite a bit of detail. There's muscle tissue. We will be looking at muscle tissue as well in quite a bit of detail. Nervous tissue. We will actually spend quite a bit of time looking at the nervous tissue, the neurons and the glial cells that make up your nervous system. And then there's connective tissue, which in anatomy, you spend a lot of time and it's super important, but in our class, we won't spend as much time talking about it. It's basically stuff like that has this extracellular matrix, you remember from anatomy, if you've taken it, things like your bones and your cartilage and even your blood, with the liquid, the plasma being the extracellular matrix. So connective, important, but not so much a focus of our class. But we will be looking at epithelial to a pretty large degree. Muscle and nervous, and this will come up. So that's tissues. If you have 2 or more tissues for a common function, what do we get then?
Organ.
Then it goes to organs. So let's put the organ in here. From tissues to organs. Right, we'll be spending a lot of time looking at organs as well. Like your heart, it's got epithelial tissue lining the chambers and actually covering the outside to make the serous membrane to reduce friction. It's got cardiac muscle to actually contract. It's got nervous tissue to coordinate the heartbeat. It's got connective tissue to give it structural integrity and also to create electrical isolation between the atria and the ventricles. So lots of different tissue types all together become an organ, and the heart has its main function to pump your blood around. So we'll be looking at a variety of organs. Then it goes to the organ systems. And well, that's not part of that. Like I mentioned, organ systems are kind of an artificial concept because everything is interrelated. You can't look at the cardiovascular system without looking at the nervous system or the endocrine system or the respiratory system. But that being said, we will use it as a convenient artifice to kind of keep everything from happening at once as we introduce things. And then, the organism, which is basically you. I think it is really important, especially in the beginning of the semester, to remember that, it's ultimately about understanding how a person works, how you work. I'm trying to make somebody look. Yay, physio. And they are functioning though at the basis of atoms and molecules and There's cells with little proteins embedded that are allowing little ions to go across and signal. And to really understand this thing, you actually do have to get down into understanding what happens to an atom if it loses an electron, and why is that important, and how does that actually help create messages that let you send a message to your leg to like kick a ball or something, you know, at some level. Or you take in some Xanax to like kind of just smooth out, like, what is that doing? Why is taking your little Xanax bar, what's it going to go do in your brain? What is it going to actually bind to on the cell membranes? And why is that actually going to kind of make you less anxious? You know, that all is only going to make sense if you're looking at the level of molecules binding to other molecules, creating influxes of ions that change the electrical properties of things. So to understand the bigger picture, you really do need to have a good feel for the smaller picture. All right. The last thing I should do before we take our break, let's talk about feedback. And in fact, actually, no, it's before, I'm going to back up. So levels of organization is a classic thing to introduce in a biology class. The other super classic thing that is at the core of most biology classes is this idea of homeostasis, which is at the core of our class as well. You know, basically, Claude Bernard, I'll butcher it because I don't speak French actually, but I like to say it because this is how he first wrote it. La fixité du milieu intérieur est la condition d'une vie libre et indépendante. Like the constancy of the internal environment is a condition for a free and independent life. Like if you want to run around and, you know, whatever kind of environment around you, you need to be able to make sure that within your body, your temperature is staying stable, your blood sugar is staying stable, your electrolyte levels are staying stable, your pH is staying stable. So there are all these, your blood pressure is staying stable. So we have all these things that we need to make sure stay at this kind of ideal level or within a range that is healthy. So homeostasis is basically trying to maintain the stable internal environment. A lot of disease conditions happen when this goes wrong and your blood pressure is no longer kept in the stable environment, or whatever reason, for whatever's going on, something is no longer in this balance. Homeostasis is typically controlled by what we call negative feedback loops. So I'm going to talk about negative feedback in a little more detail, and then I'll talk about a couple of other related things just very briefly. So in a negative feedback loop, there's some variable that you are controlling. That variable, maybe it's your temperature, or maybe it's your glucose level in your blood, Maybe it's your pH. It's something that you want to keep stable. And so in these negative feedback loops, your body monitors the value of this variable. So response is to oppose change in value of the variable. So negative feedback. So basically you are measuring one of these things, for instance, temperature. Oops. And if it changes, the response is to oppose the change. If your temperature is going up, the response will be to try to bring it back down. So your temperature is going up, you're going to start sweating, and that's going to help lower the temperature, oppose that change. If your temperature was going down, then the response is going to be to try to bring it back up, maybe shivering or something, which burns energy in your muscles and tries to warm you up. Same thing with like glucose levels. If your glucose levels are getting low, you're going to release stored carbohydrate from your liver, for instance. Your liver stores a whole bunch of glycogen and stuff. If your glucose levels are high, you're going to release insulin and tell your cells to take up the glucose, take it out of the bloodstream. So in both of these cases, whatever is happening to the variable, the response is something to bring it back down to its kind of set point value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have a question. So is it always bringing it back down, or is there a way that it goes up? I know that if you have a fever, your temperature goes up.
Right. No, so all these things, like I said, with temperature, if your temperature is dropping, you'll like shiver, which brings your temperature back up.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Or if your glucose level goes down, you'll release stored glucose from your carbohydrate stores and bring that back up as well. Yeah. So the opposing the change, if the change is up, the opposition is going down, but if the change is going down, the opposition is bringing it back up. So it'll just do whatever. It's kind of like, the classic analogy is the HVAC in your house or something. Like if you set your thermostat to 75 degrees and the temperature is 90 outside, then you'll have an air conditioner to bring the temperature down in your house. Or if it's like now snowing outside, the heater will turn on and bring the temperature up to 75. So to keep your house at 75, you might have to either heat it up or cool it down, depending on what the outside conditions are doing to you. Okay, I'll mention the two other kinds of things that we see that are not as common but are worth knowing. There is positive feedback. These are not common. They're not common, but they do exist, so you need to know about them. Examples here are like childbirth. Like when a woman is going into labor and you start getting the uterine contractions that are starting to squeeze and can expel the baby out into the world, it is triggered by a hormone called oxytocin. But as the contractions get stronger, that actually causes a release of even more oxytocin, which makes even stronger contractions, which make even more oxytocin, which makes even stronger contractions. And so basically the response to the change actually intensifies the change. So as contractions are happening, the response is actually to make even stronger contractions. In blood clotting, you have similar things too. Like one platelet will notice that there's damage and it's going to release special signaling molecules that call in more platelets, and the more platelets land and they release more chemical signals to bring even more platelets in. You know, obviously in these positive feedback loops, there's got to be some stopping point, you know, because obviously it can't go on forever. But it's different from negative feedback in that, at least for a limited time, the response to, you know, what would it be? Yeah, it's kind of like you're walking by a restaurant and there's nobody in there and nobody goes in, and it's all of a sudden there's some people sitting in there, and then other people say, oh, this place might be pretty good because there's actually other people eating there. So they come in, and now there's more and more people eating in the restaurant. And now new people walking by the restaurant, and now this restaurant's pretty crowded, and they're like, this place must be pretty good. It's popular. And even they, you know, so it's kind of like that. Like the change actually just increases the original change. And the last thing I'll mention is feed forward. So this is something that anticipates a change. So this is, again, something different, but I'm putting here because it kind of makes sense to talk about it at the same time. Feed forward, an example of feed forward when we get to the digestive system. When you are just thinking about eating some yummy food, you will start having gastric secretion. You'll start getting acids and stuff secreting into your stomach, getting ready for the food that's about to come. You haven't eaten anything yet, but the body knows that you are all excited about the thing you're about to eat. So it's like, all right, let's just start pouring the juices in here and get ready before the food actually hits the stomach. So that's the example of feed forward. There's a variety of examples of this we'll see. But it's basically when there's some change that happens, or the response is to some change that hasn't happened yet, I should say, right? So the response is to an anticipated change. You know, if you're going to vomit, before you vomit, your salivary glands are going to turn on and kind of irrigate your mouth. So there's going to be less chance of dissolving your teeth from all the stomach acid that's about to flow out through your mouth. You know, so stuff like that.